The machinery just hums along no matter what, and it's very hard to
You're right.
to figure out.
That is a really pessimistic answer.
How to
I mean,
change
you could have added to it like, the mint and sell as many NFTs as possible and buy all the cocaine and then just enjoy the rest of your days or something.
I mean, the truth of the way someone once said this to me, and I think it's right. One person's pessimism is another person's realism, and I think we're losing, and we've been losing for a long, long time. And I think any sort of strategic thinking needs to start from that base. We've won the podcast, but lost the Defense Department, and so I think we need to start seriously thinking about what would actually change things. And I think a lot of the answers from the past are just not going to hold.
In terms of, I know this is a loaded term, U.S. imperialism, I get people sometimes who will be confused by people who use it in the modern day era because they're like, well, in the modern age, the U.S. isn't actually looking
that's
to...
just wrong. This is like standard amongst historians. There are different forms of empire. If people are really interested in this, they should check out Daniel Immerwahr's book, IMMERWAHR, called How to Hide an Empire. The U.S. has literal colonies. There are 5 colonies that the U.S. controls: Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, the Virgin Islands, and the Northern Mariana Islands. So there are literal colonies where people do not have representation that the U.S. controls. And also there's what's called the Empire of Bases, where the United States has about 750 overseas bases that essentially dominate the world. By any definition, it's an empire. There are different forms of empire, but it's an empire, and everyone in the historical profession accepts that it is an empire. The people who don't do so for ideological reasons.
That was a very good answer. I wanted you to add one last caveat to it, though, at the very end. Could you explain a little bit about how it manages perhaps resource extraction, especially in certain countries? Because I think that's probably the easiest way to explain or emphasize what you were just speaking about.
Well, number one, dollar hegemony, the fact that the dollar is the global reserve currency, allows the United States to essentially control the global economy, and the military bases essentially allow it to project power. But it also has various arrangements with governments and multinational corporations that essentially keep extractive resources flowing to the United States. This is actually a really big problem. Derek, correct me if I'm wrong, but the U.S. is like 4% or 3.5% of the global population, but consumes 20% of the raw materials, something like that. It's somewhere in that range. Yeah. And so we've essentially created a global structure that just keeps on feeding and feeding and feeding the American beast through economic and military domination.
And so, I mean, people feel helpless with so many different issues, right? Whether it's global warming or whatever it is. This has to be one where it's a very difficult thing to say. If you are actually anti-imperialist, if you are trying to end that current situation that you talked about, where does one even start? And I'm probably going to merge that into a discussion about the military-industrial complex too, because it also seems like a difficult, even from I think it's a non-starter from a political issue, right? Like even people who are supposed to be the representatives of, say, progressives or the left, like Bernie Sanders, they usually don't bring up or talk often about the military-industrial complex and how it's interwoven with the U.S.'s geopolitics.
So I'm going to give an incredibly pessimistic answer, which is that there is no way at this moment. I think one of the most important things that we need to do, if you're an anti-imperialist, or I would say on the American left more broadly, is to really think through political strategy. I think I wrote actually an article for Derek's Substack, which everyone should subscribe to, called Foreign Exchanges, called The End of Mass Politics. And I think a lot of the ways we think about politics are just no longer germane to the actual political situation of the 21st century, where power has been so diffused throughout a public/private American state, and a permanent bureaucracy that essentially makes all fundamental decisions about foreign and macroeconomic policy, that it's not clear where to start. I mean, the old answer is mass protests. I'm very skeptical of that working, given the power of relationships of the early 21st century that actually dominate. So I think this is really an open question: is what form of political strategy is actually going to be useful for transforming the United States' role in the world and ending the American empire? I don't know, Derek, what do you think about that?
I don't think as much about these kinds of questions as you do, because it's not like I have all I can handle just like writing about what's happening. Literally, forget what should we do about it. But I will confess to being disappointed over the last maybe 4 presidencies really now, at how these changes in party control of the White House and the defense and security apparatus and these supposed ideological shifts really haven't made any difference in how the United States conducts its foreign policy. They've made differences on a surface level, like Donald Trump didn't talk about human rights, or he was chummy with some people that we'd rather, pretend to keep at arm's length, even as we're sort of cultivating relationships with them, like the Saudis or like, Abdel Fattah Sisi, the president of Egypt. But those are surface differences. I don't see the kinds of shifts in actual conduct between Obama, Trump, and Biden, let's say. I mean, you could leave W out of it, I guess, because of Iraq.
He's a friend of the pod.
Definitely friend of the pod. But it's very discouraging for somebody who is, without totally dating myself, a little older than Danny, and kind of, grew up as somebody who thought, politics works. You vote, you get the guy, you get the president you want. I'm a good Democrat. I'm going to vote for these Democratic guys. It's discouraging to really see this in action and how little difference it seems to make. Who you pick, and that's brought me closer to I think the position that Danny articulated, which is really the machinery just hums along no matter what. And it's very hard to
You're right.
to figure out.
That is a really pessimistic answer.
I
mean, you could have added to it like, the mint and sell as many NFTs as possible and buy all the cocaine and then just enjoy the rest of your days or something.
I mean, the truth of the way someone once said this to me, and I think it's right. One person's pessimism is another person's realism, and I think we're losing, and we've been losing for a long, long time. And I think any sort of strategic thinking needs to start from that base. We've won the podcast, but lost the Defense Department, and so I think we need to start seriously thinking about what would actually change things. And I think a lot of the answers from the past are just not going to hold.
Do you think there's no possibility of, say, genuinely a movement towards, say, nationalizing arms manufacturers so that there isn't a
No
profit
way.
Yeah.
No
just
way.
too powerful
Why would you?
to.
If you're a policymaker, you do some policy for a few years and then you become a head of the Raytheon board. Why would you ever want to do anything? And people don't even know about it. And if you're a quote unquote liberal congressperson, Raytheon in Massachusetts or whatever provides tons of jobs. That is just not realistic, in my opinion. Whether maybe we would want it to happen, but I don't see it happening.
Where would you personally say you should focus energy then, if that is just like a lost cause?
I think the most realistic thing to do is focus at the hyper elite level. Foreign policy is a hyper elite sphere, and not that many people make it. So if you're somehow able to really manipulate the uppermost level of decision making and somehow get on the National Security Council or whatnot, that's far more likely to do anything than any sort of mass-based movement. I just think that's the reality. If you look at the anti-Iraq war protests, what have you, that's just not a way for meaningful change. I don't know, Derek, that's pretty controversial. I mean, people want it to be another way. It's like Marlo from The Wire. You want it to be one way, but it's the other way. I think we got to start admitting it's the other way and then go from there.
I mean, I get people ask me, and I have a thing I do for subscribers at Substack that, it's like a job openings thing where we kind of curate a list of places that aren't horrible. They range from actually pretty good to not terrible. And people ask, can you ethically work in the establishment or in an establishment organization? And I always say, yeah. I mean, what else are you going to do? Like, what alternative is there? First of all, you got to work. I mean, I'm not going to judge anybody for taking the job that they take. But secondly, the only way you're going to have any hope of changing these organizations is to get people in them that believe that we need to curtail the empire and to start filling the upper echelons of these organizations. Now, the system is self-sustaining and it's self-protecting, so it tries to weed out anybody who's heterodox enough to question some of these things. So it's not going to be easy, but I don't know what else you do other than to buy cocaine and throw up your hands and have a party until the apocalypse.
So, is it genuinely you would come from this from a perspective of reformation from the inside? Do you think that is even realistic? Because I would only assume
both are going to fail.
Yeah, I don't think either one is realistic.
Yeah, they're both
but
going
I
to
think
fail. Yeah, that's a better
one is maybe slightly more efficacious than the other, but I don't think either one is really likely to work.
Yeah, I guess like the best you could hope to be is the guy saying in the room, "Don't bomb that." That gets ignored. So like, I mean, that's just the realistic situation. I just saw someone in the chat said, "Oh God, Reformation from the inside." I don't think so. I'd like to ask that person, what's the correct one? Leninist revolution? I mean, it's ridiculous. There's no other possibility. And we kind of laugh to keep from crying.
Well, okay, speaking of which, there is like a movement in the US that deals with what they consider to be like patriotic socialism. So the idea of like perhaps ending US imperialism, but at the same time maintaining the concept of US nationalism. Do you find those to be like diametrically opposed, or do you think there's any way that the US could be so reformed that the idea of the United States itself could remain, while at the same time it could effectively disarm in some way?
Yeah, that was kind of like the Angela Nagel article about immigration, if I recall correctly, which is like, it comes from that sort of old populist tradition of economic nationalism. I am skeptical about whether that will actually be able to work in the reality that we exist. That we'll be able to create socialism in one country, to borrow a famous phrase from the past. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty pessimistic about any actual change. I don't know what you think, man.
I mean, yeah, I this is again not something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, but I think it's it's hard to sustain it. It will be hard to sustain basic functions after a while. I mean, you just look demographically at where this country is at, and if you take the position that we should build the wall, but then have a socialist utopia inside the wall. I don't think that's sustainable. I mean, if you're going to shut down immigration, if you're going to keep everybody out and do Fortress USA, I don't think you're going to have a paradise on this side of the wall. I just don't see it.
What would you say would be the best course of action from a, let's just say, pragmatic standpoint? So fully acknowledging that
Vote
the Democrats...
Democrat.
Okay, well, say before the midterms or anything like that. But in the situation we have right now, the neoliberals are in power, and clearly there's a large amount of saber rattling that is taking place. What is the best possible pragmatic solution to come out of that then, from like a realistic standpoint?
I think the best we could do is just call bullshit as loudly and as often as possible. I mean, there's really no other solution than that. Change the next generation's way of thinking, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, again, it doesn't. I mean, I said this earlier in the call here, but it's not. It doesn't seem like it should be that big a shift to get people to stick a question in front of what do we do, and instead to make their first question, should we be doing anything? And I actually reckon with that question first. But yeah, I'm not optimistic that we're going to be able to do it. But I think the only way to even get there is to just keep saying it over and over again as loudly as possible. Like,
I actually have. Oh, sorry,
doesn't have to be this way.
I actually have a real answer. I think there's a tendency on the left to retreat into fantasy about like violent revolution or workers' revolution. And I think that's pretty dangerous. And I would suggest just try to take as pessimistic / realistic look around you about how power actually operates, about the success of the strategies that have been adopted in the past, and to ask yourself if they truly worked. We had Chomsky on recently, and I didn't want to like ask him this too hard, but I'm like, so everything you said, like your entire strategy has failed and the American empire continues to exist. And he's like, well, I still think mass movements and protest is the way to go. And I would just ask people to question that, to see what works and what doesn't, and then based on that to develop novel strategies that actually change power. The only important thing is power. The rest is just nonsense and distraction.
So NFTs.
Yeah, NFTs. So what I'm saying is American Prestige has an NFT, and I wish everyone would purchase it.
Well, yeah, I didn't know you were both so doomer pilled, but I guess if you spend like all day as a podcaster.
Doomer. So this is, this is what I think the language we have to get. It's not doomer. It's just realistic, and no change is going to happen from fantasy. Never has, never will. I mean, I guess it's funny, like we're among friends, doomer, I use that term as well, but it's just, where are we in 2022? How many dead from COVID, rising inequality, continuous American imperial expansion. It suggests to me that what we've done in the past hasn't worked. So we have to really, really think about how power actually functions in this society and then go from there.
Derek?
No, I agree with that. I think you know, I would like to have a more well thought out, optimistic take about this, but really I spend 12 hours a day reading and writing about all the terrible things that are happening in the world, and it's hard to kind of see how that turns around without a very long, painful slog, and probably something approaching a serious societal crisis. I mean, something much more serious than COVID, something climate change related, or a pandemic that's worse than COVID. That kind of emergency, and you can't sort of predict how that would play out, but I find the trajectory that we're on is it's hard to see how you get us off of that.
And a couple of quick things. One, we were really excited about the Nicholas Kristof gubernatorial campaign.
Yeah, that's a bummer too. Yeah,
that we were going to be his foreign policy advisors, and that was just a real
foreign
bummer.
Policy advisors for the governor of Oregon.
JK. But someone did say something in the chat I want to address too about social movements having an impact. I think that's right. I think the social movements of the anti-Vietnam movement essentially basically pushed America to fight light footprint wars, at least light footprint when it comes to the U.S. lives. But if you're a socialist and a humanist, and it's not just American lives that you center, I would say that the dissipation of anti-imperialist movements once we got rid of the draft isn't exactly it is in some senses a positive development, but there's a lot of significant drawbacks, because essentially what it allows you to do is wage endless war and to do enormous damage to people abroad. And so I just wanted to say that I recognize that, and it's a little bit, I think, more complicated.
Well, Danny, I just have a question. Like, say the political campaign runs of like Bernie Sanders, even though they were unsuccessful, would you look upon one of those as something like there was a galvanized movement towards perhaps a change, or did you see him just as kind of a milquetoast way of appeasing progressives or anything like that?
I was a foreign policy advisor to the Bernie campaign,
Nice.
and so with one of my recommendations, and one of my first recommendations in one of these memos I wrote was to literally just do a power mapping of the American empire, because we don't even know where power lies in this thing. It is such a behemoth with domestic and international bases that it's very difficult to even start to think about how to change that. So the first thing to do is literally to just map these power relationships, which is very difficult to do outside the government because you don't have access to all the information. But if Bernie won and he was willing to expend some political capital, there could have been a task force that was charged with spending a year literally just mapping this thing, and then identifying weak points and going from there. But right now we're on the outside, so it's very, very difficult to even get a good sense of how this thing functions.
But to have seen how thoroughly and cleanly they mobilized to destroy that campaign. So at both times. I mean, both times he ran in the primary. Just how swiftly, not even the full might of sort of the American machine, just the Democratic Party, which is this gang of like think tank rejects and grad
consultants.
Jacob Bachrach had a it was like it's not a political party, it's like a collective, it's like a house for consultants basically. But yeah, I mean, just how cleanly they stuck the knife in that campaign was I mean, depressing in a way. I mean,
and impressive. They're much better.
It was very impressive. They're better at taking out a left insurgency than they are at taking on the Republicans, for sure. But it's it was you want to talk about being doomer pilled to some extent, that contributed to it, I think, for me anyway.
Oh, that broke the global left for a while too. It shattered again with Force the Vote, and then
I mean, what happened with Corbyn in the UK? I mean, just all this stuff, like how easily the sort of center, or I guess nominally center left, is able to come down and just wreck these left movements is it's discouraging.
Do you enjoy the Serfs but prefer not to have to use your eyeballs? Many are saying this. Well, we've got the solution for you. It's the Serf Times in podcast form, available on most major podcasting networks now. If you enjoy it, please consider leaving a good review and feedback because it really helps the show out, apparently, and it's free, just like the podcast.
To our gods, Xander Corvus and Peyton L. Just, we beseech thee to smite down our enemies. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, we are but your humble court jesters, here to amuse you. To our lords, Trevor R., we give thanks for this spit of land for us to eke out this meager existence. To our knights, Merid, Cheryl Alvarez, Ruby Kelly, Ellie Leslie, Alex P., Brandon, Words Greenwood, Nate, that one guy, Hagbird Celine, Matthew Scarborough, Stellar Vision, Ariane McCarthy, Daniel Sutton, Coulter Smith, Val 9000, Jenna Tall, Quiet 185, Anna Loves Riley, Omni, Riley and Anna, Poodlehawk, The Tim Caucus, Multi Mondi, Trevor Yanis, Lemmy 101, Anthropophojack, Cern 42, Catherine, Radical Maniac, Ramon Acosta, Nkosin, Violent Orchard, Sophie Baby, Political Puppy, Andreas Chiringuito, Zach Christensen, Josh Mickelson, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. We raise our flag in a veil, and we salute you, our friends.